Hello to you all and welcome to this Constitution Unit seminar. My name is Alan Rennick. I'm Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit. I'm your chair for today's seminar, and we're talking today on what is, as you might have noticed, the 5th anniversary of the 2019 general election, about elections, specifically exploring the question of how election discourse in the UK might be improved. So in this year's UK general election, a number of important concerns were raised about the quality of election discourse. Many candidates and their campaign volunteers faced abuse and intimidation. Misinformation and disinformation were widespread. All the parties, the main parties, were accused, not least by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, of a conspiracy of silence about the costing of party manifestos, making it hard to understand or debate the real choices that were on the table. And often voters just face difficulties in knowing where to turn for trustworthy sources of information. So how big are these problems? What are their causes? And how might we address them? Well, to explore these matters, we're joined today by a really fantastic panel. Michela Palese is a much cherished former member of the Constitution Unit team here and is now the head of policy at the Electoral Commission. Chris Morris, formerly of the BBC, is now Chief Executive of Full Fact, the UK's leading independent fact checker. And Hannah Phillips is manager of the Jo Cox Civility Commission, run by the Jo Cox Foundation, which has examined ways of tackling abuse and intimidation in politics. And so welcome to all of our speakers today. Our plan is that each of them will make some opening remarks, after which we'll have some discussion on the panel, and then we'll open the floor to audience questions. So questions will be gathered today by Lisa James, whom you can also see on your screen. If you have a question that you'd like to put to the panel, please do write it into the Q&A function. Lisa will select a broad range of questions and read them out. And if you'd like to ask a question anonymously, you can indicate when you submit your question that that is your preference. And I should also just note that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the Constitution Unit's website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast after the event. So you might just want to take that into account when deciding whether to ask your question anonymously. So that's enough from me. We have many, many things to discuss. So let's crack straight on and to Michela first.
Thank you very much, Alan, for the introduction and the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So at the Electoral Commission, our role is to promote public confidence in the democratic process and ensure its integrity. And a key part of this is raising awareness of how to register and how to vote, and really make sure that voters have access to high quality information about elections. And to do this, we work closely with a range of partners to make sure that we're really tailoring and targeting that information to diverse groups of audiences. So in the lead up to the election, as Alan said, there was lots of concern about the potential impact of mis and disinformation, as well as new technologies such as generative AI. And there are also more broadly concerns about negative political rhetoric and toxicity, especially online, and especially when this crosses into abuse and intimidation. Our own survey of public attitudes from earlier this year found that misinformation was the public's second largest concern around elections, only behind bias in the media. And almost everyone we surveyed thought that this would affect how people voted in the general election. People also told us that not enough was being done to tackle mis and disinformation. So in advance of the general election, we took specific proactive action to tackle some of these concerns. Firstly, we worked with partner regulators to create a hub on our website to support voters really engage critically with campaign material that they saw online. Now, this built on a similar platform that we'd offered back in 2019 for the general election then, and it was designed to help people understand how candidates, parties, and other organizations campaign for their vote. And as I said, really encourage people to think critically about this material. We also called on all campaigners not to mislead voters and to consider how their campaign material would be received, particularly when using new technologies such as generative AI. We also worked with a range of partners, including the Jo Cox Foundation, to call for a campaign free from abuse and intimidation. And we also updated joint guidance that we published with police forces across the UK. And this was really done to support candidates know how to identify and report abuse and intimidation. So what happened? Overall, the polls went smoothly, despite the timing of the election and the fact that coincided with the summer holiday period. There was robust and vibrant political debate, with campaigners engaging in a wide range of activities and voters being able to hear from a wide range of views. Voters themselves told us in our public opinion survey after the elections that they had high levels of confidence and satisfaction in the election. And most people thought that it was easy to get information. And they also said that they felt able to make an informed decision about how to vote. Despite concerns, we didn't see widespread disruption of generative AI during the general election. And this was also the first large-scale election across the UK outside of Scotland, where digital imprints were required for online campaign material. And this was something that we had first called for at the Electoral Commission back in 2003. And our initial findings
Do you want to explain, Michela, just what that means? What a digital imprint is?
Absolutely. The digital imprints, well, imprints are a requirement on campaign material to say who has paid for and promoted, who is behind the publication of a specific type of content. And this has been a long-standing requirement for printed campaign material, but it was only at the UK general election this year that it was a requirement across the UK. However, I should say that Scotland had legislated for digital imprints for devolved elections back in 2020, and these were first used in 2021. So initial findings in terms of digital imprints at the UK general election show that overall candidates said that it was relatively easy to comply with the new regime. Despite this broadly positive picture, we did pick up on some key issues and areas that require further improvement. Over half of people that we surveyed after the polls told us that they saw misleading or inaccurate information about parties' policies or candidates. This was slightly lower, it was around a third for misleading information about how the elections work, so the electoral processes. When they encountered this type of misleading information, people told us that they generally tended to ignore this content. So only about half said that they took some specific actions, such as, for example, fact-checking the information or reporting it. And interestingly, we found that younger people were slightly more likely than those aged 55 and over to say that they took action. Around a quarter of the people we surveyed also said that they saw a deep fake, whether audio, video, or text. However, interestingly, around 1 in 5 said that they didn't know whether they had come across a deep fake, indicating that there is perhaps some confusion about being able to spot this type of content among the public. I'm sure Hannah will talk more about this, but again, we found that many candidates experienced unacceptable levels of abuse and intimidation. And concerningly, we found that this was directed in particular at women and candidates from ethnic minority backgrounds. And more broadly, as I'm sure most, if not everyone is aware, turnout fell quite significantly at this election. It was around 60%. And this was the second lowest since the introduction of full universal suffrage all the way back in 1928. Now, we know that there are multiple reasons why people might choose not to turn out and take part in the election. It might be because they're away on holiday, they might be ill or too busy. However, our research continues to find that negative perceptions of politicians and party politics affect people's decisions not to vote. And this is quite concerning and has the potential to impact broader public trust in our elections. And just very briefly to wrap up, what can we do about this? As everyone might imagine, addressing these challenges isn't straightforward, but at the Commission, we do believe that an important part of the response is ensuring people, especially young people, have access to high quality education and information about democracy and our elections. Every year, we run something called Welcome to Your Vote Week, which provides a time for educators, teachers to start the conversation with their young people about democracy and democratic education. And we're at the moment in the process of organising next year's Welcome to Your Vote Week, and the focus of that will be on dis and misinformation. We're also committed at the Commission to working with partners across the electoral community to really understand what is driving abuse and intimidation and start to collectively develop a response to that. Many will be aware that there has been a speakers conference announced and established recently that is looking into the issue of abuse and intimidation. And this is something that at the Commission we're very keen to work with and support. Government departments are also similarly looking into these issues as well. And this is something that we're working closely and engaging with. We're also quite keen to do some further research, really understanding more about abuse and intimidation, where the threshold between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour lies, so that we can understand what is driving some of this behaviour as well. And just more broadly, to conclude, we are continuing to monitor wider threats to the integrity of our system. And indeed, part of this is also looking at what is happening internationally and learning from our counterparts there. I'll leave it there, Alan, but happy to pick up anything in more detail during the questions.
Lots of really interesting stuff there. Thank you so much, Michela. We will go straight over to Chris.
Thank you, Alan. And just my fellow panelists know this already, but just to let everyone else on the call know that the internet in our building collapsed about half an hour ago. So I'm on a Wi-Fi. I'm on a hotspot from my phone. So hoping that I don't disappear suddenly, but that is the reason I do that if that happens. Very broadly, you know, I know I'm on a call with a group of people who are probably fairly obsessed with politics, but I think we all know that most people in most places don't pay that much attention to politics most of the time. The one exception to that is during elections, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks before an election. And so that is the time when journalists and fact-checking organizations like Full Fact have an opportunity to reach more people. The bad news is it's also the time when people who want to spread mis and disinformation have that same opportunity. So what happened in 2024? Well, you know, at about this time last year, you could hardly move for articles that were predicting that generative AI would essentially threaten our democracy and the integrity of the elections, not just here, but right around the world. And in summary, it didn't really happen, particularly not in the UK, as Michela has already indicated. Why not? I think it was partly that the elections were a little bit earlier than expected. So if you were planning some sort of campaign, that might have taken you slightly by surprise. It also was probably that the election never really felt that close, in particular with then cabinet ministers saying 3 weeks before election day, we know we've lost. If you are running a bot farm in St. Petersburg, you're probably not going to be targeting an election where the outcome seems pretty certain. You're going to probably tend to focus more on closer elections. We were a bit concerned about specific constituencies that were close, where we thought if there was an opportunity for malicious actors to have an impact, that would be the place where it would happen. We saw a few examples. Fake audio, for example, of Wes Streeting in a constituency which was relatively close, but nothing, I think, that essentially affected the outcome or even threatened to affect the integrity of the election as a whole. It's also, I think, worth pointing out that we didn't think it was ever that likely that generative AI was going to have such an impact. When the election was first called by Rishi Sunak, within 24 hours, I'd done interviews with the BBC, with Sky, with ITV, all asking the same question: how are deepfakes going to affect this election? And the answer I gave was always hopefully pretty simple, is that most people are going to hear far more misinformation out of the mouths of real people, real politicians, than they are from anything that is fake. And there is a danger, really, of spending so much time looking for the fake stuff that we forget to focus on what politicians actually do say. And as the campaign went on, so it proved. I mean, and there are obviously different types of misinformation, and some of it is stuff which is deliberately or otherwise misleading which is spoken by politicians. So we had the Conservative warning that Labour would put £2,000 on your tax bill. We had the Labour warning that the Conservatives would put £4,000 on your mortgage. We thought both of those claims were dodgy, and they made assumptions that made the figures that they were using unreliable. And we repeatedly said that, but both parties kept using the same figures anyway. So that was a bit disappointing. It was an example of where, certainly in the hurly-burly of an election, fact-checking maybe struggles to make an impact, because we weren't alone in pointing out that these numbers were not necessarily as watertight as the parties were presenting them. Others, including the BBC, Channel 4 Fact Check and others, said similar things. But towards the end of the election campaign, we used our AI tools to monitor a week of broadcast outlets, TV, radio, podcasts, 40 outlets monitored 24/7 for 7 days, and there were thousands of uses of these same figures among politicians on their Facebook pages and elsewhere, when both of those numbers had essentially been, if not debunked, certainly called very much into question. And our argument is that this matters. We know that there's a problem of trust. The Ipsos Veracity Index has just come out, and 11% of people in the UK trust politicians to tell the truth. The only good news is that it's better than last year, when that figure was at a record low of 9%. Nevertheless, if we're talking about 90% of people in this country essentially saying they don't trust politicians to tell the truth, that's a pretty sad state of affairs. And I think there's a real danger for our political system and for our democracy in that, because there is a danger of getting to the point where no one believes anything that anyone says in politics. And if people don't believe you, they won't trust you. And if there is no trust, there is no consent. So it seems very clear to me that in the interest of politicians, and it is also pretty much the duty and the responsibility of politicians to take the lead in trying to restore that trust. One other thing I wanted to mention, which I mentioned briefly already, and that's the role of technology. We know that technology plays a big role in turbocharging the spread of mis and disinformation, but I'm absolutely convinced that it also absolutely has to be part of the solution, because only by using AI tools such as the ones we built at Full Fact can you hope to tackle misinformation at internet scale. Our tools were used in the UK election by a couple of organizations, in the US election, and in 9 other elections around the world, many of them in Africa, during the course of 2024. And what our tools do is they don't replace human beings. There are plenty of startups and others out there who say, yeah, we've got AI that can do the fact checking. You don't need humans. We just don't believe that technology is reliable enough. You still need the human beings to add the context, to add the nuance, to add the caveat. But what the machines can do is take what can be, in the course of a busy election campaigns, tens of thousands of sentences, maybe even more than that, and say, look, we've gone through it. We've used our large language model to recognize the language in which claims are made. And here are the maybe 200 or 300 sentences today that you may want to focus on out of the tens of thousands that have been spoken. So it's a way to use technology to enable human beings to focus in the place that they can make the most impact. Does the fact that we didn't see particularly bad outcome in 2024 in our election mean that we just take our foot off the gas? Clearly not. We only need to look at Romania in the last week or so, the cancellation of the presidential election there by the Constitutional Court, after it was given evidence of Russian meddling on social media, primarily TikTok, to massively boost support for the unexpected frontrunner in that presidential election from the far-right fringe. I think it underlines the need for something that Full Fact has recommended for several years now and does not exist in the UK, which is the creation of a critical election incident public protocol. The model we recommend for that is Canada, where the protocol provides a very public, depoliticized mechanism for warning anybody and everybody about incidents or interference that could threaten a country's ability to have a free and fair election. And we believe, the technology is getting better all the time. And at the moment, if there's an arms race going on, the bad guys are probably winning. So the more we can have a transparent system for dealing with it, the better it will be. And that's it for now. Back to you, Alan.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Much to get our teeth into there. Finally, over to Hannah.
Thank you for having me. My name is Hannah Phillips and I am Civility Commission Manager at the Jo Cox Foundation. For transparency, I should also say that I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford, and we're actually using Electoral Commission data to try and understand abuse and intimidation. Tackling abuse and intimidation is something I think about a lot in kind of various ways. For those of you who might not know a lot about the Jo Cox Foundation, the charity was set up in 2016 following the murder of Jo Cox, and we work on issues that the late MP was passionate about, including respectful politics. The Civility Commission was launched last year, and we released our call to action report in January with 28 recommendations on how to address abuse, intimidation, and violence at all levels in all the nations and regions in the UK. And I should say that we work on these issues not because of the way that Jo died, but because of the values in which she lived. She believed passionately in the diverse representation and robust debate. And we really believe, and there's increasing evidence, that these values of representation and that proper robust debate in democracy is really being impacted by the rise in abuse and intimidation. And during the general election, it was our aim at the Jo Cox Foundation to raise awareness of the issue of abuse during campaigning and advocate for a civil election. And we were really pleased that we joined forces with the Electoral Commission to kind of call for that civil election. So we've got a few kind of takeaways from our work and experiences during the election. And it's clear that abuse and intimidation, kind of as Michela and Chris also kind of touched upon, remains kind of a major issue for politicians and candidates to contend with. And particularly that more should be done to build that trust and engagement. That lack of trust and engagement is kind of related to abuse and intimidation in politics. There were various examples of abuse and intimidation in politics, and it's really important to recognize that this isn't related to one specific issue or one specific parties. We had incidents of objects being thrown at Nigel Farage from Reform. We had racist insults on Conservative Rishi Sunak. We had experiences of the Labour MPs, Jess Phillips and Shabana Mahmood in Birmingham. And these are just a few examples of the various incidents that we saw, and that kind of made it to the national profile. And because this issue isn't about just kind of one policy area or one party, it means that there is a complex issue to address. It's not just that we can target one particular group of people and so on, but there are things that we can do, which I will get to. One of the most concerning aspects of abuse and intimidation that we particularly saw in this election is that it may be changing the way that people, and especially women and others already underrepresented in politics, engage with politics. So it's not just a case that, for example, people don't want to vote or people don't want to run for politics, but there's a more kind of nuanced chilling effect that seems to be a result of this abuse and intimidation. For example, the Electoral Commission research from the local elections earlier this year showed that there was quite a high proportion of people, I think higher than it ever should be, that didn't want to speak about controversial issues or campaign alone because of that fear of harassment they might face. And that was particularly prevalent among women. And in the general election, we saw that a number of candidates cancelled hustings appearances because of fears for their own safety. And if that is the way that people are, people are scared to engage in politics in a kind of open way, that is really, really concerning for kind of our open democracy and that having that proper debate and so on. So those are kind of some of the kind of problems that we're facing. A couple of the kind of positives that we saw from the election is that there were more resources. For example, the set of elections this year were the first elections in which spending for security costs were exempt from election spending limits. And that was a recommendation we had in our Jo Cox Civility Commission that a lot of other people have been calling for. So that's a really kind of sort of practical positive step. And there was much more guidance that had already been happening over years and from the Electoral Commission, the police and others, as Michela said. So there were hopefully more kind of resources than there had been in the past, which is it meant that there was more opportunity, hopefully, for people to know what to do if something happened. Another kind of related positive, though it's double-edged, is that there was more awareness about the problem of abuse. Obviously, it's a double-edged because you don't want abuse to be happening, but it is important that we know that this is happening and that it does have an impact on our democracy. We had a civility pledge that we created jointly with an organization called Compassion in Politics, and that was really important as kind of a marker for candidates to say that they were going to have a respectful campaign. And when there were incidents, we were really encouraged to see that there was kind of cross-party condemnation, so politicians, different parties were being vocal in condemning abuse and attacks against politicians from other parties. Obviously, that didn't happen all the time, but when it did happen, I think that's really, really encouraging. And that's one of the ways we can kind of change the culture, because no matter your political beliefs, we should all be concerned about intimidation, because when intimidation and abuse happens, you're not having a debate, it becomes abusive. And just kind of finally, one of my kind of personal reflection has been seeing the kind of media interest in abuse and intimidation grow, and importantly, not just focusing on the incidents, because I think when I started kind of doing interviews about incidents, it was, the kind of framing was this incident is really bad, like abuse is really bad. I was like, of course it is, but there are things that can be done. There's lots of people working on this issue. And now I proactively get asked the question, what can we do? So again, that sort of shift in the framing is really encouraging in terms of hopefully changing the culture. And we really, really do believe that that things can change and that politics can get better. It will take a lot of work and a lot of different people working together. And kind of a really kind of large scale culture change in terms of trust engagement and, making abuse no longer this sort of kind of normalized, expected part of our politics. As I said, it's important to note the progress made in terms of support. Also, the progress made in terms of diversity in this parliament was really important. And it's important not to take the marks of progress for granted and really safeguard them. We have several recommendations from the Jo Cox Civility Commission. I'll just mention two. I won't go through all 28, though you should all read them, because obviously we think they're fantastic. We worked with a lot of people to create them. Firstly, and this this references to what Chris said as well, politicians really need to model good behavior, particularly those in leadership positions. It really kind of starts from the top in terms of this culture change. And then the second recommendation that kind of relates to what Michela was saying is that political literacy needs to be improved so that everybody understands the different roles of elected representatives. And that's not just during election campaigns. We believe that should be a really important part of the curriculum. It should be an important part of kind of public awareness campaigning. And that way will help kind of create this culture change. And I'll just kind of end on our kind of longer term vision for a political culture. And that's one where diversity is celebrated and robust debate brings us closer to the spirit of Jo's message that we are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us. Thank you.
Wonderful, Hannah. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And so many things for us to discuss there. You may have noticed that we have lost Chris in the last few moments. As he said, his internet connection is a little bit dodgy, but hopefully he will be back with us before too long. We've already had some questions come in from the audience. Many, many thanks for those. If you haven't yet submitted a question, now's the time to start thinking of your questions. So do get your thinking hat on and submit those questions, and we'll come to those in a little bit. But before we do so, let me just ask a few questions to each of our speakers, building on the discussion that we've had so far. Michela, maybe good to start with you. And I guess I'd be interested with both of you, hopefully all of you, when Chris comes back, in your further reflections on what you've heard from the other speakers as well. And Michela, particularly interested, I guess, in your thoughts on the recommendations that you've heard, both from Chris and from Hannah there. So Hannah made several recommendations, particularly about political literacy, about the role of public awareness campaigning. And so obviously the Electoral Commission is already doing some of that, but can the Electoral Commission do more? Would the Electoral Commission want others to be doing more? What are the Electoral Commission's views on what should happen there? And also Chris talked about our critical election incident public protocol. He's just got back onto the call in time to hear your response to that recommendation. So be interesting to hear your thoughts on those things, Michela, but anything else you want to pick up that others have said, do feel free to do so.
Thank you, Alan. I think I'll begin just by picking up on those points around public awareness and information. I would say absolutely, we do see our role as the Electoral Commission as critically providing that clear and accessible, high quality information to voters. And also, I think it was Hannah who mentioned it. It is a year-round process, not just thinking about in the lead up to the polls. There is obviously different messaging that might be required when minds are being focused, when people start to pay attention a bit more to an upcoming election. But we should definitely be looking at this holistically, and that is very much the approach that we take here at the Commission in terms of providing that democratic education, engaging with young people, but also with voters overall in terms of political and media literacy. It will be no surprise, hopefully, for everyone on this call to think about the fact that, of course, there is currently a government manifesto commitment in terms of extending the voting age to 16 and 17-year-olds. No further details as of yet, but that is definitely something that we are thinking about here at the Commission. We already do lots and lots of work in Wales and Scotland, where for devolved elections, 16 and 17-year-olds can already vote. And so thinking about how we can bolster the work that we do in terms of providing democratic education resources and engaging with younger people, but not forgetting again to engage with people across all age groups, because we do think that media and critical literacy are skills that should be applied across a variety of age groups. Another point that I just wanted to pick up on, which Hannah mentioned, was just about thinking about all elections, not just the biggie general election that happens every 4 to 5 years. So of course, we're already starting to think about the May 2025 polls, never a moment's rest at the Electoral Commission, and really thinking about what we can do to start putting some of that support and that guidance in place for candidates and campaigners at those elections to really make sure, as I said earlier, and as Hannah said as well, that they feel that they are supported to identify and report abuse and intimidation, that they have access to those resources. If they don't, that they know where to go and find them, that there are signposts in place. And as we've been saying, addressing these issues will require coordinated action from a range of partners, but it is definitely something that we're committed to work on at the Commission.
Great, thank you. And any thoughts on Chris's proposal for the critical election incident public protocol? I hope I wrote that down correctly.
I had also made a scribble of that actually to go and take a look to look into it further after this. I would say that is definitely something that we would be keen to explore at the Commission. Already we are part of, we have been engaging, for example, with the Defending Democracy Task Force, with the Security Minister, with some of the things that the government has put in place. And I think, just as I said, as much as possible, tackling these issues collaboratively and looking at them in the round is the approach that we should be going for.
And I was interested, Michela, that both you and Chris talked about the role of generative AI in this election, and that the role is quite limited. I'd be quite interested actually just to understand a bit more about how much do we know. I mean, I don't know, Michela, this probably isn't your area within the Electoral Commission, so feel free to say that's for someone else to answer. But how much do we actually know about the role that AI is playing? I was interested that both of you were quite confident in your statements on that.
I think the shorter answer is there is still much more that we can learn and know about generative AI. I think one of the things from our perspective at the Commission is we think that the material that has been created using generative AI should be clearly labeled so that voters know that it is generated and created material. I believe the Alan Turing Institute recently issued a report which had similar findings, and they found, I think it was only about 16 cases of AI disinformation during the election that were confirmed. but I don't know if Chris may have more to add on that.
Chris, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, just, I mean, there was plenty of use of AI, but most of it was kind of satire. Here's Nigel Farage or Keir Starmer playing Minecraft. Pretty obviously not true, even if potentially some people believed it. And the one thing you don't do is fact check satire. Satire is satire, and it's always been part of the political process and always will be. So there was certainly usage, but there didn't appear to be any malign, deliberately designed program to use deliberately created fake material to alter the outcome of the election. And that was certainly a concern, I think, at the beginning of the year. And just to add to the critical election protocol, I think the point about it is, I'm sure there are plans in place in this country. If there were to be some big information attack a few days before an election, things would happen. It's just that they're not very public. And the most important part of having a protocol like that is that it is fully transparent, so that the public have trust in a process if a process needs to take place very shortly before an election. And so the more public and the more transparent it is, if it's all written down very clearly where people can read it, that sort of process has much more chance of gaining high public trust in the event of an attempted interference of that kind.
Great, thank you. And Chris, do feel free to pick up on any other points that you heard from Michela and Hannah. I was particularly interested in what you would think about what both Michela and Hannah said about political literacy and education. I think I'm right in saying Full Fact has been thinking quite a lot about these sorts of issues and the role of education in sensitizing people to the quality of information. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about what your thinking is exactly in that area.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think enabling or ensuring that as many people as possible have the ability to navigate their way through what is a confusing information environment in which technology changes at bewildering speed is absolutely critical. There's a curriculum review going on at the moment. Everyone who cares about this should make their views known to it in whatever way they can. We don't review the curriculum very often. We need much more emphasis on critical thinking in schools, but we also need it as part of lifelong learning programs. When we did focus groups over the summer about what does misinformation mean to people, overwhelmingly the most popular answer was, oh, financial scams. My granny or my grandpa got scammed last week. So it's not, who would you trust to navigate the world of technology more? A 14, 15, 16-year-old or somebody in their 80s or 90s who may be more confused by it. So it's important that we have a system which needs to be society-wide to give people the tools they need to have the confidence to navigate the information environment in front of them. So that's kind of what I'd say on that point.
Great, thank you. Hannah, do you want to pick that up as well? Because I think I remember when I read the Commission's report that your recommendation about political literacy was very much focused on people understanding the system, the political system, because that will help them appreciate what the kind of limits of what politicians can do might be, may be able to reinforce trust somewhat. But presumably there's also an important role for education in what you said just at the end of your remarks about the kind of vision for society and our ability to listen to each other, to disagree well with each other. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. So again, we have a kind of political literacy section in the report, and one is focused on kind of the school curriculum, and we partnered with the Electoral Commission and others who did a kind of joint a submission to the curriculum review, and our recommendation that is based on the work that a lot of political literacy experts have done over a number of years, is that there should be this kind of impartial political and media literacy training as part of the school curriculum, which should include addressing how to deal with information sources and misinformation. So that kind of critical thinking that Chris was saying. And I think we would certainly support that kind of more kind of disagreeing well, and how you have a debate in person and a debate online without it becoming abusive. Another one of our recommendations is that government should implement these significant awareness campaigns for the general public, aimed at increasing the understanding, exactly as you were saying, Alan, about the role of elected representatives. And the reason we kind of came to that recommendation is a lot of the politicians, staff that we spoke to said that part of the reason that kind of incidents can escalate to become kind of abusive or intimidatory is that someone comes to ask for help, in a really difficult situation, and they want help from their elected representative, but they've approached the council when it was an MP, or they've approached one of the levels of local government when it's a different one, and that can be really frustrating. That kind of lack of that kind of not knowing exactly where to go for advice and who exactly is responsible, what exactly the roles of MPs versus councillors versus your police and crime commissioner and so on. So that kind of really, and that kind of understanding is really low, and increasing that kind of understanding and how you can ask for something from elected representatives in a way that you definitely need advice, and they should be giving you advice, but in a way that is not abusive. And our final bit on political literacy was that councillors and parliamentarians should regularly visit education institutions, their constituencies, from primary schools to colleges and so on. And a lot of them do that regularly, but that seems to be that's a way in which the role of elected representative can kind of be demystified from and when people are in these education institutions. And just a final point on this, nearly every politician I spoke to who talked about visiting schools said the first question they get asked is that, how do you deal with the social media abuse? And from these kind of teenagers get asked that. And I think that's really concerning that's the first question that gets asked. It's become such a kind of normalized part of our political culture that politicians get abused online. And when we want to encourage people, really good people, kind of people from different range of backgrounds to get into politics. It's just really important that we tackle abuse, harassment, intimidation in all these various ways.
Thank you. Final question from me before we go to audience questions. We've been getting lots of questions, which is great, but do still keep them coming. Hopefully we'll have time. So Hannah, just picking up a little bit further, this point about cultural change that you're emphasizing, and the central importance of that. So education is clearly part of what might achieve that. The report also talks about the responsibility of politicians themselves in order to model good behavior. I wonder, what exactly does that look like? What are your expectations from politicians, and how they'll speak with each other?
So it's a great question. I think one, kind of as I mentioned, one really encouraging aspect was when politicians were calling out abuse directed at people of other parties, or even their direct opposition candidates in the election. And I think if it's about supporting each other across party, I think that's really important, and disagreeing well. You can really, really disagree, and as you should. That's kind of what politics is about, being able to disagree on the policy, kind of not criticizing the person. That's kind of a really kind of basic, nice principle that elected representatives can kind of take away. And something we don't go into detail in the report, and but lots of kind of other colleagues have talked about, is how political practices might change to be a bit more constructive rather than more combative. So that's also something to think about. But I really do think on an individual level, politicians can just think about how they engage with each other. And I think a lot of politicians do engage really constructively with each other. And a lot of what we kind of see in the media is that 10 minutes for Prime Minister's questions, where a lot of politicians work is committed by cross-party committees where they're actually working really closely together. So seeing more of that sort of constructive work that they already do would also be really helpful.
Yeah, I'm tempted to go back to Chris to find out what his thoughts on how we get the media to engage. Chris, you have indeed unmuted, so perhaps we'll go back to you. How can we get the media to be a bit more responsible, perhaps, with this stuff?
I mean, so I was going to make a slightly different. I'll come to that.
Okay.
The other people that we need to talk about that have a real responsibility and a role here, and enormous power as well, of course, are the very largest internet platforms. These are the most powerful corporations the world has ever seen. They have enormous, unprecedented influence over the type of information we consume and the way we consume it. One of the things we're trying to do at the moment, we're having conversations with those companies, is about annotating large language models, which means training the models behind the user interfaces like ChatGPT, like Gemini, which are going to be the places where more and more people are going to get their information in the future. And it's pretty simple. If you put garbage into the models, you're going to get garbage out. So the better quality of the information that goes in the first place, hopefully, the better the answers that will be generated by those models. So that's really important. I think the internet platforms, we have a full transparency. We have a funding relationship with both Google and with Meta, but we're also very critical of them sometimes from a policy perspective, particularly about their reluctance to share sufficient amounts of data. They have probably more data than most governments about how mis and disinformation develops, how narratives spread, what are the most effective ways of damping down the spread of bad information. But of course, that data is their business model. It's the secret sauce, and they don't like to share it. And we are keen, and we're hoping that as part of the data users and access bill, which is going through the Commons at the moment, is that there will be, on a slightly restricted basis, but there will be more access to researchers and to fact-check organisations like ourselves to that data, so that we can do more to sort of cut off bad information before it influences too many people.
Great, thank you very much. We must go to audience questions, and I know there are lots of great questions that Lisa has been getting, and she has magically reappeared on our screens. So Lisa, over to you. What do you have for us?
Yes, many thanks to everyone who has submitted questions. We're going to start with 3 questions covering some broad topics that the panel's raised, and in some cases asking for a little more elaboration. So Justin Fisher, first of all, says, thank you for the excellent presentations. My question relates to voter perceptions of misinformation. Public opinion surveys frequently exaggerate concerns on election, especially around corruption. Moreover, a perception of seeing misleading information is not the same as it actually existing. So how then should we use these findings to guide policy on genuine misinformation? Melanie Field says, completely agree on the need for public education to build political literacy. Any views on how to persuade government to embed this in the school curriculum? And any thoughts about the relationship between low political engagement and concerns about falling standards in public life, and how we can join up the thinking here? And finally, a question from Anonymous. Does or could something exist along the lines of a statement about what a good election would look like? Perhaps including manifestos that address issues voters care about, low levels of misinformation, important difference, low levels of abuse, high turnout, perceptions of legitimacy regarding the outcome, with a view to getting political parties to sign up to this sort of vision in advance.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. So maybe we should start with Chris this round, with Justin's question in particular. So Justin Fisher, professor at Brunel University and enormous expert on elections and political parties, about how far we can base policy around misinformation, around evidence on perceptions of misinformation.
Yes, I think perceptions are really important, as also are definitions, actually. And I think one of the mistakes that people sometimes make is to assume that facts and truth are the same thing. And those who criticize fact-checking, and they are quite numerous, especially in the United States at the moment, where there are people who seek to equate fact-checking with censorship, say we're trying to be the arbiters of truth. And actually nothing could be further from the truth. Facts are not the same as truth. If somebody says to me, this is my truth, I'm thinking, well, you're saying this is your opinion. Whereas what we need and what we are calling for and what we are trying to create is a world in which there are some verifiable shared facts on which political debate is based. So we don't really mind what opinions people have about those facts, and there are legitimate debates to be had on all the issues in our politics. But if we cannot agree on some shared facts to begin with, that's where political debate runs into really difficult territory. So I think it's understanding the difference between verifiable facts and the much broader, much more subjective notion of truth. And our focus is very much on facts and making sure people still believe there are a body of facts which stand up to statistical scrutiny on which we can have the important debates we need to have.
And do you want to pick up anything on the other two questions as well? So there was the final one on what a good election looks like, and then Melanie Field's one on, I mean, I guess your answer to the question of how we persuade the government to put these things in the curriculum is that we submit our recommendations to the curriculum review. But do you want to say anything more about that?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it is partly get involved. I mean, I think one of the questions was asking about how you sort of join up the dots with standards in public life. And one of the things we've done in the last few weeks is launch a government pledge tracker, because one of the first things that Keir Starmer said in his first speech after his election victory was confirmed was to say that, you know, the battle for trust is the great political battle of our age, and we want to be judged by measurable targets. So, you know, so where do we start? Well, we think, you know, the manifestos are not read by everybody, but if it's the closest thing we have, if you like, to a contract with the people, where political parties set out a series of things they're going to do. So we've started a government pledge tracker, which we will add to because we know that, you know, manifestos are not set in stone and things change, as we saw with the relaunch, which was not a relaunch last week, with the 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know how many missions they have now. But we are tracking through the course of this Parliament. We've got 50 pledges. We think we can get that up to about 200, so that people have some confidence that when politicians make them promises, there is a way to measure how successful they have been in achieving them. I don't think anyone expects a political party to have 100% ticks on every issue, but I do think it's right that people have a way which is accessible to be able to judge on the issues that matter to them how the government that's been in power has done.
Yes. Hannah, do you want to pick up any of the questions?
Just that, yeah, I also agree on the point about kind of making this link between kind of low political engagement and kind of low standards in public life. I think kind of, I guess, one of our broader aims in the kind of Jo Cox Foundation with the Civility Commission work is that we want this kind of, we envision this kind of public life in which there is this, you know, really robust debate, diversity, you know, and that might seem really far away, but it doesn't have to be. And I think related to the point about, you know, what would a good election look like, I think that sort of thinking about what we want and how we can work to get there can be really, really helpful. Great,
thank you. And Michela, so I guess Justin was responding to your Electoral Commission data on misperception or perceptions of misinformation, rather. So feel free to pick that up or anything else.
Thanks, Alan. I was, going to pick up Justin's question and comment on that. I would say, firstly, absolutely, I think we can all acknowledge limitations of asking some of these questions in public opinion surveys. And as Chris said, even just the way that the question is phrased has an impact. And it's definitely something that, putting my research hat rather than policy hat on, it is something over which there is debate about making sure that we're phrasing it in a way that is as neutral and understandable as possible. However, all of that notwithstanding, I am intrigued, I would say, by that 18% of people who responding to our post-poll survey about whether or not they'd seen any deep fakes, said that they didn't know. So despite all of the concerns, all of the reporting, the potential for there to be exaggeration or misunderstanding around some of the impacts that these new technologies had, the fact that around about a fifth of people said that they didn't know and didn't feel, it suggests that they didn't feel confident enough to be able to recognize that content. It does raise some concerns in my mind about whether more could be done in terms of that. Again, going back to the critical and media literacy piece. On just to pick up on a couple of the other questions, Absolutely. Hannah mentioned we did organise a submission to the curriculum review along, I think there were about 30 to 40 signatories to that, including the Jo Cox Foundation, as it is definitely something that at the Commission we're quite keen to make sure that we're involved and engaging with in terms of the impact of education, having a good education. I think in terms of persuading the government, in addition to that, I think just demonstrating that things can be done. As I mentioned earlier, we run Welcome to Your Vote Week, and that really shows that more could be done in this space to have those democratic conversations with young people. And somebody earlier also mentioned school visits. That is something that we've started doing as well at the Electoral Commission, facilitating some of these school visits for MPs to really just show them what it's like in those educational settings. And just finally, on what a good election looks like, I don't think there's anything set out officially around that, but I think actually that was a really interesting question, and I think it's something that we have in the back of our minds when we're, for example, looking at the research and producing our reports. There are some underlying themes and trends that we do want to pick up, and it's I guess not just the exceptions that have arisen in the course of a specific poll, but also some of those points about low participation crucially among specific groups, under registration, because then being able to look into that and pick up on those indicators and where they're perhaps lower than they should be, then also enables us as the Commission to think about where we should be focusing our resources as well.
Great, thank you very much. Lisa, back to you for another round of questions.
Thank you. So this round is about the methods that can be used to tackle misinformation and disinformation. So Claire Armand-Jones picks up on something that I think has run through some of the discussion already, but asks in more detail. All great projects and essential, but you're all working against social media disinformation that's likely to increase hugely between now and the next general election. Don't we need to tackle this too in order to be effective? Frank Geoghegan-Quinn asks, why can't political parties and individual representatives be held accountable for spreading disinformation and indeed telling outright lies? Does the panel believe that the criminal law has a part to play in this regard? And Sean Morris asks, what could or should local authority election officers do in promoting safe and robust campaigns? Should they challenge mis or disinformation directly during a campaign, or is this more a role for the police?
Wow, thank you. So this is very much in the information, misinformation, disinformation terrain. So I might focus here on Michela and Chris. Hannah, do feel free, of course, to come in. Michela, what would you like to pick up there?
I'll firstly just pick up the point about the work with social media companies, which again, Chris has alluded to as well in the course of this conversation. I think absolutely that is definitely one of the areas of action that we need to be working with in order to tackle not just mis and disinformation, but also abuse and intimidation, as I'm sure Hannah and others would agree on as well. We do and have done some work with social media companies. We engaged with all major social media companies during the election campaign, to make sure that the information that they were publishing about the election and about the electoral processes was accurate. And this also included working with some of the AI companies, and again, just making sure that some of the responses that the chatbots and some of these models were giving were accurate, and if not, that those were promptly rectified as well. In terms of whether politicians should be held accountable and whether there should be a criminal offence around those. I think as others have said, that the key for us at the Electoral Commission is to have that scrutiny through open democratic debate, and also through the important role that the media plays to kind of make sure that there is a test of the accuracies of the claims that are being made. But ultimately it is campaigners who are responsible for those messages. And there are some laws in terms of defamation, incitement, also not making false statements about the personal character or conduct of a candidate. So there is, I guess, a wider ecosystem of approaches that could be taken in that regard.
And there's been a proposal, just relating to Frank's question, in Wales for the law to be changed such that it is against the law for politicians and candidates to lie. Has the Electoral Commission expressed a view on that?
We have not expressed a view. We don't have a view on that proposal. Obviously, if it were to pass, then we would have a role in terms of providing guidance in order to make sure that there was compliance with that where relevant.
Okay, looks like Chris does have a view on that though. So over to you, Chris.
Yeah, so the proposal in the Senate for criminalizing lying in politics, I don't think, and we don't think at full fact, that's necessarily a good idea. Getting the judiciary involved in casting judgment on politicians has some potentially dark echoes, and the issue of who stands judge and jury over politicians is something I think we have to think about very, very carefully. We would rather there be a system whereby parliaments, plural, so whether in Westminster or Cardiff or in Scotland, do a better job of putting their own houses in order. So earlier this year, we managed to work with parliamentary committees to change the rules in the way that corrections can be made in the House of Commons. It used to be that only ministers could make formal corrections. Other MPs could only make a point of order a couple of weeks later and say, oh, I made a mistake 2 weeks ago, but that would not change where the original mistake was made in Hansard. Now, under the new system, the correction is shown at the same place where the erroneous statement was made. Where we have not yet made progress, and we were pushing for more progress, is what do Parliament, in this case we're talking about Westminster, but I would extend that to Wales as well. What do MPs do about those who refuse to correct the record when it has been shown conclusively that something they have said is either wrong or misleading? And we would like there to be a more robust system whereby MPs take responsibility to set an example, if you like, of those who are knowingly misleading their constituents. Obviously, the ultimate judge of that is the voters themselves. That only happens every 5 years, and the pace at which information moves means that we think the best way to have a more robust system is for, as I say, politicians to put their own houses in order and have a much clearer and easier system whereby MPs can be punished in some way if they refuse to correct the record when it has been shown that what they have said is wrong or misleading.
Very interesting, thank you. And do you have any thoughts in response to Claire's concern? I think Claire was expressing the worry that we have a unstoppable tide of garbage coming through social media, and the sorts of interventions that we're talking about don't seem likely to be adequate for that challenge.
I mean, in some ways, I think she's right. I think I said earlier that, if you like, the war about information, the bad guys are winning at the moment. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. And it's important to try and set and maintain high standards, both in politics, but also more broadly in trying to build a better information environment. And I do think, as I said before, that part of the answer is also to use the technology which is enabling the tsunami of rubbish to flood across social media is also the technology that we can turn to good, to be able to spread good information much more quickly and effectively. One of the things I'm trying to do at Full Fact is find ways to intervene much earlier in the information cycle, if you like. If you think of the sort of creation, production, dissemination and consumption of information, traditional fact-checking sort of comes right at the end of the process when people are already consuming it. But there are ways, and critical thinking is one of them, to intervene much earlier to ensure that people have access to good information in the first place. I mean, I know there's a lot of academic debate, if you like, about pre-bunking and what that term should even mean and how it works. But I do think it's incumbent on all of us to try and, if you like, clean the environment and not just let the swill take over.
Yeah, great, thank you. Hannah, do you want to come in on any of this in this round?
No, I was just interested listening to the to what Michela and Chris were saying. I would just kind of reiterate what Chris said about technology can also be you know, helpful. You know, the one, I guess, kind of practical tip in terms of addressing kind of abuse online is to kind of call out when if it's facing other people, so you're not as a victim having to kind of deal with that, but kind of particularly when it's someone you're known to disagree with, you know, if you're calling it abuse directed at them, that can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Lisa, round 3.
Great. So we'll start with a question from David Blake, who asks, would it help for opinion polls to be banned during elections on the basis that they can influence how people vote? And then we have 2 questions which in slightly different ways are trying to get at what we know about the drivers of disengagement from politics. So Sheila Tremlett picks up on statistics mentioned by Michela and by Chris and says, how far does practical and psychological disengagement from politics stem from the current electoral system, which effectively disenfranchises parts of the electorate? Referring, of course, to first past the post. And Keith Raffin asks, do the panel think turnout would be increased by having polling day at the weekends and in months perhaps when voters are less likely to be on holiday, suggesting March, May and October as just such months. And finally, we have an anonymous question which might frame some of this, asking whether there are lessons, whether positive or negative, that we can draw on from other countries in thinking about how to strengthen election discourse and public engagement with politics.
Fascinating. 4 more great questions. Thank you very much. Hannah, let's go to you first. I guess some of those are, again, more focused on the information disinformation side, but issues around the causes of disengagement from politics. Be interested to know if the Commission has thought at all about whether some people sometimes suggest that we might have more inclusive, less combative politics if we moved away from first past the post. I don't know if that's something that you've looked at all. And also lessons from other countries. Would be really interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we haven't looked specifically or going to take a view on the electoral system specifically, though of course there's lots of other organizations and research kind of on that. I think one thing we think about is more kind of how politicians and the public can engage with each other and more generally. In terms of lessons learned from other countries, I think kind of focusing kind of on abuse and intimidation, I think it's interesting and concerning that this kind of issue of abuse intimidation does seem to be kind of a global problem. And I think that seems to be related to this kind of growing kind of mistrust in political elites kind of in democracies around the world. You know, you think about what happened January 6th, 2021 in the US, the kind of attempted or planned insurrections in Germany. There are examples of kind of growing examples of violence, abuse, intimidation, seemingly related to this sort of mistrust in political elites in what we would kind of usually characterize as kind of more stable democracies. Kind of with my kind of more academic hat, what's really interesting in the research kind of in violence, abuse, intimidation in kind of democracies is a lot of this kind of this research used to be focused on areas of conflict immediately post-conflict, but now we're seeing it in kind of geographies that we wouldn't have thought were kind of conflict. And you think about when Jo Cox and Sir David Amess were murdered, they were murdered in their constituency in a what was by all accounts a peaceful kind of context. But I guess in terms of, I know the question was on lessons learned from other countries, but I think one of the silver linings of this being a kind of global joint problem is there are things that we can all kind of learn from each other. I've kind of been at a European level. I know the kind of European kind of speakers of different parliaments are learning from each other about kind of how to protect their parliament. So that's one thing that they're learning from each other. But I think in terms of kind of joint solutions, there's still a long way to go. But again, working together can be really helpful. And hopefully we'll see kind of more of that going forward.
Thank you very much. Chris, over to you. Any of those questions? I might be particularly interested in your thoughts on whether it would be good to ban opinion polls.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm necessarily speaking for full fact on this, but as a personal view, I think it might actually, yes. I'm always staggered by the amount of time which is spent on opinion polls, even as journalists say, and of course it's only one poll, but then they go on to talk about it for the next 10 minutes. The way we cover politics, particularly in this country, really is politics as pantomime and politics as personality. Who's winning, who's losing, who's up, who's down. And that, I think, has to be to the detriment of having a slightly more serious policy debate. I understand why it's done that way, in the sense that, people respond to competition, who's winning, who's losing. That's quite why they like PMQs every week, because there's that sense of actual political theatre. But it also means that that I do think that serious policy debate can sometimes therefore go unnoticed. And I think the media of which I used to be a part needs to do better at explaining and making complex policy issues more accessible. And I think banning opinion polls in the last few weeks of the election campaign would be an interesting place to start on that. And the other one I was going to pick up on, Alan, I mean, voting at weekends is an intriguing suggestion. I've lived in countries and reported from countries where that is the case. France, for example, votes on a Sunday. I'm not aware of any sort of research which shows conclusively that Sunday voting leads to higher turnouts. I mean, there is a crisis of democratic accountability or democratic participation, rather, I think, across the Western world. And I think just changing a day of an election is not necessarily going to be the answer on its own. Politicians, again, as I've said before, need to take the lead in restoring trust in people, and therefore potentially encouraging more people to vote by setting the highest possible standards.
Thank you. And Michela.
Thank you, Alan. I also wanted to pick up on the offering of voting at the weekend, perhaps, or more flexible ways of voting. It's something that we have looked into at the Electoral Commission, and we've done some research around, and this is a nice plug for everyone to have a look at our flexible voting studies from last year, because even though our research does find that people in the UK are generally happy with the current ways of voting in person at elections, there could be some alternatives, including advance voting, for example, at the weekends, but also mobile voting, so not voting necessarily in an allocated polling station, being able to potentially vote elsewhere in a polling station of one's choice. And actually in Wales, a couple of years ago, I think it was at the 2022 local elections, some options, there were some trials of advance voting there in the weekends preceding polling day. So definitely something to be learning there as well. And actually then that goes back to the point that was made in the question, but also by Hannah, just about learning from other countries. And I would put as well, learning from different parts of the UK as well, which have different systems, different ways of approaching, for example, not just voting systems and voting, but also in Northern Ireland after the election, there was a fund set up to provide enhanced security for members of the Legislative Assembly there. So it is definitely something that we're very keen to just keep monitoring at the Commission, both internationally, but also what we can learn from across the UK too.
Fascinating, thank you. And that international lesson learning can tell us things in response to Sheila's question as well, about whether changing the voting system would have an impact on levels of engagement. And I think it certainly, last time I looked at that literature, it was the case that it's pretty clear that turnout in elections is higher under proportional representation. But on the other hand, there's not clear evidence that satisfaction with democracy as a whole is higher. So it seems pretty clear that you don't have the same problems of wasted votes, for example, under a proportional system. So that may be a driver for higher turnout, but it doesn't look as though those sort of underlying concerns about public confidence in democracy and the underlying behaviors that lead to lack of trust in the democratic process are much influenced by the nature of the electoral system. So that has been a really fantastic conversation, and I have certainly learned a lot from that. I hope our audience members have as well. Before I thank our speakers, let me just mention a few things. So the recording of this seminar, which I mentioned earlier, will appear on our YouTube channel and our podcast feed in the coming days. So please do subscribe to those if you haven't already done so, or you can look out for information about them on Twitter or on Blue Sky. The Constitution Unit is now on Blue Sky as well as Twitter. If you're not already signed up to our events mailing list, then you can do that as well. In order to hear about our forthcoming events, you can just follow the Get Involved link on the Constitution Unit's website. We haven't yet quite finalised the details of our next event, but Michela was talking earlier about the introduction of votes at 16 in the UK. And all being well, fingers crossed, we will fairly soon be announcing an event in January that will be exploring that issue in more detail, which I'm sure will be of great interest to many of the people on this call today. So again, do look out for that information. But with that, let me thank everyone here today for joining us and taking part in this discussion. And let me especially thank our three wonderful speakers who've enlightened us so much. Michela Palese, Chris Morris, and Hannah Phillips. Thank you. You've been really great. Thank you also to Lisa James for fielding the questions, and for Ed Rowe in the background for making sure that everything ran so smoothly. May you all have a good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye-bye.